The way the regulator has kept SEROXAT's safety under review, though, has raised concerns that were supposed to have been resolved 40 years ago, after a scandal where thousands of women took a drug that hadn't been properly tested and gave birth to babies that were deformed. That drug was called thalidomide.
Their mothers took thalidomide to prevent morning sickness. As a result of the tragedy that followed, an early warning system was set up. It's called the Yellow Card Scheme. If doctors suspect a drug has caused a serious side effect, they're supposed to report it to the MHRA on a yellow card. In our last programme, we exposed serious flaws in the Yellow Card Scheme. Two experts who appeared on that programme asked the regulator afterwards to show them all the yellow card reports gathered on SEROXAT. Normally, secrecy rules prevent access to this data, so they were astonished when the answer was yes.
We jumped up and down with glee. We thought this is the first time that any such analysis had ever been done, and of course at the back of our minds was the feeling that we were not only now in a position to evaluate how well the regulators had understood the problem of SEROXAT, but also how good the yellow card system was.
They were given unprecedented access to every single reported side effect ever lodged about SEROXAT, and it's one of the most complained about drugs in the scheme's history. These were reports that were supposedly scrutinised during each of the previous safety reviews.
It hadn't been properly analysed, it hadn't been properly followed up, it was full of the kind of jargon that obfuscated meaning. It made things very unclear and uncertain, and it would be hard to imagine a sort of less helpful construction of the data that there was.
What amazed me was the haphazardness of it. For some things there was a lot of detail, for other things there was nothing, and it took a long while to make sense of it.
They found 91 yellow card reports from doctors who suspected SEROXAT had prompted their patients to become suicidal, to self-harm, or to kill themselves.
He clearly stated that he had not thought about suicide until taking SEROXAT.
Even when a report ran only to one line, there was often little evidence it had been investigated further by regulatory staff.
Patient shot himself a few days after starting medication.
You think, for heaven's sake, I mean, what is happening? Is this an extraordinarily callous doctor reporting, on a tragic event with indifference, or actually isn't what the doctor is saying is, here's the reason to come and see me, this needs to be followed up?
We have evidence that suspect drug drove patient to suicide.
When information like this comes in, this is investigated. The way that we investigate the individual reports, and then we take...
And how do you do that? You go back to the doctor and follow it up?
Yes.
But that happened in all of these cases?
Not in all of them. In the appropriate cases, these patients are followed up. The follow-up rate for yellow card reports is some 48-49%.
The MHRA says that all suicides have now been followed up. If not straight away, then as part of the current safety review. But what about the previous safety reviews? Why didn't they investigate every reported suicide then?
These people, working in secret, had assured the public through ministers that they had done 3 investigations into this particular problem, suicidality, and each time the drug came out with a clean bill of health. And they were not warranted, they were absolutely not justified in drawing that conclusion.
Not only has the regulator failed to follow up some signals that suggest SEROXAT has driven some patients to suicide, the researchers uncovered something else in the yellow card reports. Another potential risk that hadn't been identified by the regulator. Evidence that suggests the risk of suicide could be closely related to changes in dose.
Dose increased from 10 milligrams after 2 weeks on treatment. On the 4th day of starting the 20 milligram dose, patient committed suicide by hanging himself.
Half of the suicide reports that we looked at were associated with some change in dosage. either when the drug had first been started, when the drug was building up in the body in the first few days, or after a dose change had occurred, either an increase or a decrease in dose. So that was a relationship which hadn't been spotted before.
Patient committed suicide after having increased dose from 20 to 30 milligrams.
On the day that Adrian Keegan died, he told friends he'd taken 3 20-milligram tablets of SEROXAT instead of the usual one, in the hope it would make him feel better. His parents now believe that's why he hung himself.
That is what's happened to Adrian. Adrian has increased his dosage. Now, some might say he did it himself, but if he had have known, he wouldn't have done it. So the increase of dosage killed Adrian.
Advice to doctors has always been that depressed patients should be started on 20 milligrams of SEROXAT. In practice, the dosage is often increased. But last October, the expert working group discovered something shocking. Firstly, there's no evidence that SEROXAT actually works any better above 20 milligrams for depression. But secondly, rapid increases in dose are much more likely to cause serious side effects. This was spotted, according to the MHRA, after staff took a more rigorous approach to clinical trial data they'd had for 15 years.
They looked at the data and discovered that the data they had from that original submission indicated that SEROXAT had little benefit above 20 milligram dosage. And the side effects, particularly around withdrawal, increased quite dramatically post 20 milligrams.
As the patient's representative on the expert working group, Richard Brooke felt this information should be released straight away. But for 4 months, nothing happened. Eventually, he told the MHRA that if they wouldn't tell patients, he would, even though he could be breaking the law.
It's one of those moments where you have to say, actually, if I don't do this, I can't really live with my own conscience and my own views.
Although he was trying to help patients, the MHRA threatened Richard Brooke with legal action. A letter from the chief executive warned he could be prosecuted if he published the new dosage information about SEROXAT.
Clearly, it's got huge implications. I mean, clearly it potentially is around my job, my livelihood, my reputation, my career. It affects my family, my daughters, my wife. So huge implications. It wasn't like this is something you do lightly.
In the end, Richard Brooke got his way. The regulator wrote to doctors about the group's findings. Curiously, though, this crucial new information was presented as a reminder.
It lacked honesty. What they actually did was say, after extensive review, we have discovered this is a reminder we ought to give to people. That was absurd. I mean, the information had been around. The MHRA just didn't admit to the fact that either they'd missed it or, even worse, they hadn't actually bothered to tell people.
There was a difference in views as to whether the agency had sat on information, and Richard felt, I think, that the agency had sat on information in those, and we were quite clear, the agency is quite clear, it had not sat on information on those.
You're not quite getting Richard Brooke's point, are you, that patients need to know this information as soon as it becomes available? It's their health.
It is a matter of regulatory and practical judgment as to when information should be transmitted. When it is in the public's interest that information should be transmitted rapidly, we will do it.